Okay, welcome to your Eng 1500 Week 9 lecture. This is going to be on risk management and OH&S, which doesn't sound like the most interesting lecture of all time, and I fully get that. But this is actually something that generally has been quite a well-received lecture and people have found quite interesting. We're going to try and do it in an interesting way, and we're going to make sure we don't get bogged down in anything, all right? So just to start the housekeeping off, as I always do, I'm super stoked with how the course is going. In my opinion, everything is awesome. The projects are all going really, really well. People are getting into like a building phase now, which is incredible to see all of your hard design work starting to pay off. Uh, if you're not building yet, you should be. Even if you're not fully fixed on what you want your exact design to be, start prototyping, start building, start buying materials this week before your workshop this week. Seeing the teams that are already building, I can assure you it's providing them enormous value. So if you haven't started building yet, please start. For those of you who are building, great, go for it. You're killing it. It's awesome. I'm really, really happy with how you're going. It's really cool to see your designs coming together. So course is going great. And oh yeah, today's going to be a shorter lecture. As I've said, we're trying to tone down the lecture in both difficulty and quantity of material. And today we are going to be a bit shorter. I'm aiming for an hour and a little bit today, but we'll see how we go. It definitely won't take the full 2 hours. Is the point of my story. So, to contextualize a bit of this WH&S, OH&S stuff for you, it goes by a few different names. WH&S is an older term, or WHS. The new, more correct term is occupational health and safety. And this is fundamentally important to you as an engineer. It is like going to control your life, okay? But I understand that there is a fairly large negative stigma around WH&S from a lot of people. A lot of it is seen as, perceived as bureaucracy for the sake of bureaucracy and not actually about keeping people safe. It's more about ass covering or legal requirements or whatever. Um, and yeah, I get that. I understand. I've seen some bits of this that I would be highly critical of. But that's not actually what it's here for. A lot of the time, you will be exposed to this in very trivial cases. You'll be asked to do risk assessments and things on exceptionally trivial things, and that trivializes the entire process for you. But it shouldn't, all right? There is a very good reason why the OH&S stuff exists, and it works in the way that it does. Um, and you can see examples of this all over the place. There's like a whole subreddit dedicated to this. I joined a Facebook page dedicated to this recently. These are the types of things that happen if you are in a place that doesn't have OH&S regulations in the same way that we do, or doesn't enforce them. You end up with people in horribly dangerous situations. This is not, shouldn't in the 21st century be an acceptable level of risk to put an employee at, all right? But it's not just large scale employment, it's also at a personal level we get this type of thing, all right? We get people getting injured and into dangerous places because they're doing stupid things because they're thinking about problems the wrong way around, okay? So there is a reason why we want to have the WH&S, OH&S. And if you roll back, sort of, okay, this is the example I'm going to use, the Snowy Hydro scheme, is a series of tunnels and aqueducts and stuff that they built in order to help generate hydropower out of the Snowy Mountains river system in Australia, right? So you don't need to read this text, but you're talking 225 kilometers of tunnels built between 1949 and 1974. And this is when our OH&S was just starting to emerge into what it is today. Okay, it was where we started to implement things like safe working procedures and stuff like that. And it was generally heralded, the Snowy Hydro scheme, where they introduced some of these things, as a success from a safety standpoint. And that's because they only killed 0.6 of a person on average per mile of tunnel they dug. Only. Why was this good? Looking worldwide, in the US you were killing on average 2 people, and in the Swiss Alps on average 3 people per mile of tunnel you dug. That's how it used to be. That was just what it was to go to work. That's not how the world is anymore, and partly this is to thank for that, right? Now, okay, maybe digging through the Swiss Alps is harder than digging here. I don't know. But this this used to be the reality of the world. And we are trying to improve on that, and that's important for us to be. So, although we sometimes can get lost in the paperwork, acknowledging where we came from is important. Cool. So, this is going to, as I said, rule your life as an engineer. You can't be a functioning engineer without considering OH&S basically at all stages. And it's not just in something like your construction or mining industry, although it's really important there. It is actually across the board. But it is very different in different industries. So depending on where you are, different industries take this, have different levels of focus on that. One of the interesting fun ones that I like to talk about with most of my students in my workshop, anybody who's worked on large mining sites and things, whether or not they're allowed to use a Stanley knife. See, if you're a shelf packer at Aldi or Big W or whatever, you're probably given a Stanley knife or equivalent box cutter. And most people just like, yeah, okay, it's a knife. It is a fireable offence to have some of these on mine sites because they're considered dangerous, and some mine sites take safety so unbelievably serious nowadays that they will work around things like making sure they don't give their employees knives. So it's different in different industries. It's super industry dependent. Whatever you end up as, a whatever type of engineer in whatever field you end up, uh, this will look different to all of you, but it will be important for all of you regardless. Okay, so I'm going to try to not get too specific with anything we talk about today. I'm going to keep it high level. I'm going to keep it general. So hopefully it's applicable to as many of you as possible. We'll talk about some. Oh, okay. So also, we're not going to tell you anything that's super novel. You actually know how to do the vast majority of OH&S that exists. You just maybe don't know how to contextualize it, use the correct terminology, or understand the correct terminology, or use the correct templates to flesh it out. So there are, in some cases, very specific ways in which this is known to work well, and I'm going to show you some of those templates. But once you realize how they're supposed to work, actually using them is generally really easy and 100% something you'll be capable of doing. Anyone who wants to build at home their engineering, their Eng 1500 projects, I'm going to ask you to go through and do some risk assessments and things on your projects, particularly if it is dangerous. But even if you're going out and building a rabbit hutch or whatever, you should be doing this stuff as well. It doesn't take very long, it's super easy, and it really can help you to stay safe or help the people around you to stay safe. As you probably noticed, I'm not going to say that the systems that we use are flawless. They're certainly not, and I will point out some of my personal gripes with some of the systems so that you can understand them a bit better as well. And as I've said a few times here, this is going to be highlight drill. All right, learning how to do OH&S is years and years of training, and you will get on site years and years of training. We're just doing highlight drill here, okay? So don't ever think that because you watched half an hour or whatever of Dylan talking about this, that's everything there is to know. Okay, and you will 100% meet people out there who will contradict some of the things that I'm going to say here. And that's totally fine. Okay. All right, sweet. So one of the things that I like to start about when we talk about this, I said the lecture was on risk and OH&S, and they're very, very similar things. OH&S is generally risk applied to people getting hurt, but risk management as a whole applies more to just people falling off of buildings and stuff, right? It actually applies to all sorts of different aspects of engineering and life in general. So one of the main bits of risk management that I now do in my professional life with the company, well, I did with the company, was investors. So when we talked about trying to raise money and getting people to invest in our company, that conversation is predominantly, basically, it's a risk analysis. That's what it is. I'm talking about what are the risks of investing into here? How likely are they to happen? What could go wrong? How are you going to manage them if they do? Or how are you going to manage them such that they don't? So it applies, these things that we're going to talk about apply more to more than just you physically falling off a building. A really common example is password complexity. So you'll often see in order to make things safer, you've got to have your password which has a this and a that and a symbol and a number and a capital and a Greek letter and a whatever else. And that's actually generally a very bad way of doing risk management because those types of passwords become very difficult for a human being to remember and actually not that more difficult to brute force hack. What you want is actually longer passwords because longer passwords like a phrase, for example, purple monkey dishwasher, is really easy for a human being to remember, but it's not impossible, but unbelievably hard to brute force attack by a computer trying to hack something. So it's just looking at our risk management in a more correct way in areas outside of just falling off buildings and stuff, all right? Really common one 18 months ago or so was the big conversations around autonomous vehicles, and when they're in a situation where they have to have a collision, either you hit the pedestrian or you drive into the metal pole, what do they do? That's entirely risk management, right? 100% that's a risk management decision that had to be hard coded in by an engineer somewhere. Cool. So good risk assessments, and we're going to see this later, look at 100% health of people, physical health, but they'll often also look at social, environmental, and economic impacts and risks associated with all of these. So risk management is bigger than just OH&S stuff, although that's going to be our running example and what we talk about most. Be aware, however, that it can be applied more broadly. All right, so if we want to be good at risk management, 100% your mindset is the most important thing. So if there's one thing you take out of this entire lecture, I want you to take this slide, all right? Mindset is the most important thing. What you want to think when you're looking at a process, I don't know, I'm going to take my bit driver and I'm going to get a screw and drive it into my whiteboard behind me to hang it. When we do our risk analysis on this, 100%, what we want to be careful of is our mindset. So what we don't want to do is be thinking about how this process is meant to work. I'm meant to hold the thing up. I'm meant to put the screw on. It's meant to stay connected to the magnetic bit, and it's meant to drive itself in as I spin the drill. Yeah, this is all meant to happen, but that's not what we do when we look at risk. What we look when we do risk analysis is what could go wrong. Okay? So what could go wrong in this process? Well, for example, this bit could get flung out of the drill and hit me. And you say, but that's not supposed to happen. These things are designed with these key locks in them to prevent that from ever happening. And you're correct, it is, but this is the wrong bit. All right, this isn't the correct. This is meant to go in a screwdriver, not meant to go in a drill, and it's the wrong shape in order to engage into that thing. And so, whilst it's meant to be held rigidly in place, it is not, and it can come out at any time, and now we have a hazard. All right, so changing that mindset is super important. The thing that I have seen once in my life hung up on a wall somewhere in an old printed, pixelated, crappy version was this cartoon. And this fundamentally is the way that you should think about safety. All right? Focus on the trap, not the cheese. Most of the time, you're trying to engineer something, you're trying to build something, you have a very clear goal in mind. When you do your risk assessments, it's very important for you to park that goal. I don't care about what the goal is. I don't care about the cheese. Let's think about the things that can go wrong. Let's think about the trap. All right? If you can get in this mindset, you'll be fine. You will find this entire process is really easy to do. If you can't get into that mindset, you will miss unbelievably obvious things and people will get hurt as a result. All right? So focus on changing mindsets. All right. One thing you take away from this whole lecture, please take away that. So our example, we're going to go and buy a lottery ticket, all right? I know that this is a kind of trivial example, and I'm just going to use it for explanation purposes, but the example that we're going to work our way through today is, let's say you wanted to go and buy a Powerball ticket. I'm not condoning gambling, but let's assume that that's what you wanted to do. So what you normally need to do here is identify, change our mindset. Yes, we want to go and win Powerball, and that's going to be great. But what are the things that can hurt us along the way? All right. So we're going to do an example of crossing a road. And then you can apply what we're going to do here to all sorts of other parts of your life. So the process, what we do is we identify the steps. So establish steps. I need to move over here for this slide. So we establish the steps. In order to go and buy a Powerball ticket, we need to get up, leave the house, whatever that might be, step one. We need to travel to our location, might be step two, to the newsagents, and then we need to go through the process of buying it at the newsagents. We can break a problem into these parts, and then we can do the risk assessment on these parts, because they might all be very drastically different, right? The risks of standing in line at a newsagents could be different to the risks of traveling there, so we'll break it up. So establish the different steps. Identify the hazards. So hazards are things that are going to hurt us somewhere in this process. And we're going to break each of these steps down, by the way. So this is just kind of the summary slide. Identify the hazards, identify the things that will hurt us. Then we determine the risk. So we look at that hazard and we look at how likely it is to hurt us and how badly it's going to hurt us. And that gives us a risk. And once we know our risks, we can implement management strategies. So how can we reduce the risk? Either reduce how likely that hazard is to hurt us or reduce how badly it's going to hurt us. And then we repeat. You'll find this process is often iterative and you don't get them all the first time. And as you're looking at risks, you realize you missed a hazard or whatever. That's totally fine. So I don't want you to think that this is a one and done process. This is generally a repeated thing. So knowing that, let's go back to our example. Looking at this, what are some of the hazards you can think about when we cross a road? What could hurt us in this process? Chuck them in the comments below and, hit that like and subscribe button. No, just whatever. You don't have to put them in the comments below. Just think about what some of your hazards are and, just what some of your hazards are. We don't need to worry about how likely they are or how badly they're going to hurt us at this stage. We just want to identify things that could hurt us. Okay? So I'll give you a second, have a think about it. Pause the video if you want to think about it for longer. But assuming you found a couple of hazards, 5, 10 hazards is sort of the types of things that I would expect you to be able to find here. Now, the most likely is obviously getting hit by a car, and most people get that pretty much immediately. But, there are others as well. So let's flick through some of our hazards. Oh, by the way, this is the official definition of a hazard according to some of the WH&S regulation in this country. Anything, including work practices or procedures, that has the potential to harm the health or safety of a person. So I'm going to show these excerpts every now and then when we see hazard and we see risk and stuff like that. I'll show you the official definition. You don't need to remember it. Doesn't matter. Some of the text, by the way, is going to get a bit small, but there's going to be pretty pictures, which will make it better. So what hazards can we identify? Getting hit by a car is an obvious hazard. I hope all of you figured that out. Crossing a road, a hazard is getting hit by a car. Cool. We can then think about this as, okay, we have a collision hazard. We can have two things collide or something collide with us or whatever, and that can create a hazard. Is there anything else that could be a collision hazard? Well, we could walk into a pole. That's a collision hazard. Maybe something else could collide with us. Maybe a cyclist could collide with us. Maybe that's something that we need to think about differently. No, maybe. So we've got some collision hazards. We could trip and fall. That's another hazard that we could have. If you've ever been in a pair of thongs on a rainy day, walking across the road and stepped on the white strips, there's like zero friction there. Slip over really easily. You could do some damage to yourself, certainly. We could step on something sharp. So there's often sharp things on the road, bits of glass or whatever after an accident. This is a common thing. We could step on that. We could get hurt. Horrifyingly, you can buy coal traps on eBay for like $10. This is terrifying that this is a thing that you can purchase and somebody could just throw on the road. And there was a story. It came out of the States, probably 2 years ago now, of people throwing these all over jogging tracks. Because, I don't know, they're just evil people. But this was a thing that they were doing. We could get hit by an asteroid. And yes, this is obviously a ridiculous example, and I'm going to use it as a ridiculous example through this process to kind of point out some of the, not the flaws, but at least the bounds of how this process works. But we could get hit by an asteroid crossing the road. It's certainly a thing. I'm going to use this. Let's think about, okay, we've gone outside. Are there other hazards from being outside that we maybe haven't thought of yet? Sun glare is potentially a hazard. So whilst this may not hurt you too badly, it could change the probability of us, for example, having a collision. And it might not even be sun glare in our eyes. It could be sun glare in the eyes of the drivers who could then run into us. So we might want to consider this type of hazard as well. We also might want to consider hazards related to walking. So you're probably all running under the assumption that we're walking a short distance here, but it's a 5-10 minute walk or something like that. What if it was a 5 or 10K walk? Because we're also using this as our weekly exercise. Are there hazards that start to emerge? What if it's a 20K walk or a 30K walk? Maybe there's some new hazards that we haven't thought about yet related to walking long distances and these types of things. This is all stuff we want to consider. And the reason why I point this out is to make this next point. Risk assessments, or risk analysis in general, is often situationally dependent. So crossing a quiet street in the back of suburbia could be a very different problem to crossing, say, a racetrack, right? Still crossing the street, but there's a very different set of risks associated with this. And there might be a different set of hazards associated with this. It might be different again if we're going to cross in a different country that has a different way of doing the way that its pedestrians and its streets and stuff like that work. And it could be different again and we move into, say, a New York City or something like that, where pedestrians actually rule over motorists on the road, and it changes again. But we can see from this that it's the same problem every time, but the situation really can dictate some of these hazards, yeah? One of the things that you want to take away from this is just because somebody else has done a risk assessment on something similar to what you're doing doesn't mean it's necessarily okay. You can take that, you can look at it, you can use it as a basis, but you really want to think independently for yourself as well. The other thing that you want to take away from this is the unbelievable risk that is created by somebody who doesn't understand a process very well doing a risk assessment. Okay? If you don't understand how something works, you're really not qualified to do a risk assessment. And you will see this commonly in industry. People will be employed to do risk assessments across the board on things they don't understand, meaning they can't identify hazards correctly and they can't assess their risks correctly. So you want to be very, very conscious of that. If you're doing one on a process you don't understand very well, just go and grab somebody to help you. Okay? I'm going to talk later about one of the major things that you want to do is do risk assessments in teams. All right, super useful. Okay, so we've gone through this. We've tried to identify as many hazards as we can. We've looked at all of our we've acknowledged that our situation might be different to those who came before us. I have 3 questions I like to ask myself as I get to the end of my hazard identification. And they kind of help me clarify what I want to prioritize. You don't have to do this. This is just something I like to do and I think it helps me a lot. Number 1 is, what's the worst case? And my worst case is always, how do I kill more than one person? And I always start here. Well, I always start or finish here. I make sure I address this. How can I kill more than one person? What situation would I have to concoct where I could kill more than one person? One of the people who I've worked with in my life, who I've collaborated, I've worked for Red Bull for a while. And they are the best people I've ever seen do risk assessments. And it's because they do such high risk activities all the time, right? So where I worked for this time when I consulted for Red Bull, it was about Flugtag, which is where you build the competition where you build your gliders and you push them. We pushed them into Sydney Harbour. And I was employed to consult for them as both an aerospace engineer to help people design and build their gliders, like just a consultant. They would design and build their gliders, but they got a couple hours with me to consult and give them advice and stuff. And as a health and safety person on the day. So I wasn't in charge of, they asked me to consult for when I thought things like what weather conditions would we call the event off in, what are big safety hazards, are all our craft safe to fly before we let them launch and that type of stuff. So one of the things that we had to look at was upset conditions, as in how windy could it be before we called the day off and stuff like that. And anyway, point is, whilst working through this process, what I was looking for predominantly was, how can I kill more than one person? And it turns out it had nothing to do with throwing the aircraft off the launch platform, because there is one pilot in that scenario, and you're going to work pretty hard to kill them because the amount of safety procedures they have around that pilot is insane. What I actually determined the highest risk was there was 40 of these crafts sitting in a field 30 meters away, surrounded by spectators. It took a wind velocity of about 40 meters a second, at which point some of these crafts would have lifted up and thrown themselves backwards into the crowd, of which we had many of them, and we could have killed a whole bunch of people. So that was actually our upset condition for the day. It had nothing to do with this, it had everything to do with one of the unmanned craft being thrown into the crowd. And once we acknowledged that, it was super easy to solve, right? We went and bought a bunch of sandbags. We weighted them down with sandbags. Great. Mitigated a problem super easily. So that's always my worst case. Always the thing that I do is worst case scenario. If we roll back to crossing the road as an example, what's our worst case scenario here? How do we kill more than one person crossing the road? Well, you don't. The car does. The car swerves to miss you because you crossed the road at the wrong time and it runs over a family. That's probably the worst case I could see, right? So I need to think about crossing the road, not whether or not I'll get hit, but whether I create a hazard for somebody else where a car swerves to avoid me and hits somebody. And you hear these horror stories rarely, but you do hear them, of the person who slammed the brakes on the highway so that they didn't run over the small animal, and a car behind them smashed into a pole and everybody in the car died. It's a thing. It happens. It's horrible, but it does happen, and we do want to be aware of these because that's how we avoid the horrible scenarios. So, what's the worst case? Definitely do that. The other one that I like to do is what's the most likely thing to hurt somebody? Doesn't have to hurt them badly. Could be a paper cut, whatever. But what's the most likely thing to happen? And you're going to see we're going to do risk matrices in a minute, and they're going to have consequence and they're going to have probability on them. So I look at the two extreme ends of this, the most likely thing to happen and the most severe thing to happen. And is there anything we can do about this? And then the other one I like to do is what is the easiest thing I can make safer, regardless of where it sits in the matrix. But where can I spend 30 seconds on the process and make it measurably safer? So I like to ask myself those three questions. I think it really helps with hazard identification. Okay, this is a page pulled from the University of Newcastle's risk assessment documentation, risk template. I'll link that in the description below so that you can see it. There's some parts of this risk template that I really like and some parts I don't like so much, but this is part of it that I absolutely think is brilliant. It's just a big old list of hazards that you may or may not have in your process. So after you've tried to identify all your hazards, you can go to this big table and just be like, have I considered noise? No, I haven't. Are there any hazards with noise? Probably not. Maybe if it was at a racetrack, there would be, but if I'm crossing a suburban street, there probably isn't. All right, cool, move on with my life. Is there anything with light? Yes, we acknowledge sun glare. Is there anything with radiation? If we're walking 20 Ks to and from the post office, yes, we could probably get sunburnt. We haven't considered that yet. Maybe we should tell some people to wear some sunscreen. Okay? So it just allows you to flick through a whole bunch of them really quickly. They're not all going to apply. That's fine. Doesn't matter. They don't need to. It's just, have I thought about all of these things? I think that's a super useful thing for you to have. Cool. So that's hazards. And that's like the first bit of the process is identify all of the things that are going to hurt us. Once we've done that, we can switch out of identifying the things that are going to hurt us and start to assess how important they are. All right. So what their risk is, separate. Hazard is the thing that's going to hurt you. A risk is about how likely that is to happen and how damaging it will be if it does happen. Okay. So again, our official definition of our risk is the combination of the likelihood and the consequence of a specified hazard being realized. It is a measure of harm or loss associated with an activity. Nice legal definition. Technically correct, but very confusing. A risk is how likely something is to happen, times by how bad it will be if it happens. This is risk. All right? It's separate to hazard. This is risk. Each of your hazards has an associated risk. This is terminology that is difficult and used by lay people very differently to the way that it's used in risk assessment, so I'm being careful with my terminology here. All right, so you do this, and the thing that gives you the highest number is basically your highest risk, and it's the thing you want to try and address first. It's the thing you should be most worried about. And then you can work your way down and go, okay, this thing, although it might be bad, is so unbelievably unlikely to happen, we don't care about that as much as something else. All right? But this is really complicated maths, of course. Super complicated equation. So you know what we have in reality in industry? We have tables. So some risk assessment things do actually get you to do a calculation and get a number, but most of them simply have a table. So what we've got is a consequence, how bad it's going to be if it happens, over here. And we've got our likelihood. So what is the chance of it happening here? So you just pick your hazard, you check for likelihood, you check for severity, and it gives you a risk rating. Okay? Super easy to use. There's nothing complicated about that. Now, this is the universities one. I'm going to show you a couple others from a few other industries because this is part of the university's risk assessment thing that I'm not a huge fan of, to be honest. It's not bad, but I think it's missing some things. So here's a different one from a different company. This has got some things on it I like a little bit more. It's the same basic structure: severity, so consequence, and likelihood. But what I like about this one is in likelihood, never heard of in the industry, heard of in the industry, has happened in the company more than once per year in the industry. Okay, it's giving us some numbers, whereas this one just gave us rare, unlikely, possible, which means you just get caught in a debate about what is the different, how likely is likely, how often is that? Well, this one gives us some numbers to use for that. Another thing that I really like about this is it has insignificant risk down the bottom. So anything that comes out in gray is insignificant, which means you can flag something and go, I identify this as a hazard. But once I do my risk on it, I go, this is so unlikely and is going to do such a small amount of damage if it even occurs that I don't need to worry about it from here, which allows you to identify more hazards. All right. But the major thing that I prefer about this type of risk matrix is there's three columns that I've currently hidden from you. So we're talking about this in terms of injuring people, right? There's an additional three columns. Assets, meaning money, things that cost money, so buildings or infrastructure or machines or whatever that could be damaged and cost money. There's environment. What are the effects on the environment of doing this thing? Do we have a task? And okay, crossing the road doesn't really make sense here, but maybe building a new building or something like that, where it's going to have environmental, well, it may have environmental risks. We should consider that as well. And reputation. So what's this going to do to the reputation of our company? Another one, and I understand this one's super pixelated. This is the best image I could get, but it's a really nice one because it's got sort of the same deal on it. People, and then property, environment, and community. So this is a mining company, I believe, and they're really concerned about environment and community, which most people are very surprised when they see that from a mining company's risk assessment, but it's a reality. Reputational risk. Destroying a community or destroying environment costs mining companies enormous amounts of dollars. And more companies nowadays have really strong environmental and community conscience because that's actually what makes them successful as companies. So all of these things can go into a risk assessment. Also to note here is their probabilities are drastically different from the ones beforehand. And that happens all the time, all right? So you will see these are all conceptually the same, but where they draw lines, what they put into different boxes, how damaging something has to be to get in a different consequence or a different likelihood, changes based on the industry that you are in. And you will just have to adapt to whatever industry you're in. Some industries are more risk adverse than others, all right? Some have a different risk appetite than others. Some that are, the worst you can do is a paper cut, probably has a very different risk appetite to underground coal mining where you could kill 10 people in a split second. So different risk appetites, right? What I want you to take away from this is conceptually the same, learn the strategies, adapting to your environment. So if we go back to our example, we're going to cross the road. We're going to pick what our hazards were. So one of our hazards was getting hit by a car. We're going to say that's severe because we could definitely die. So potential fatality or injury or illness or permanent disability. If I get smacked by a car walking across the road, definitely that could happen. So that's severe. And it happens, now we're in the argument, right? Like what is certain, what is likely. People get hit by cars all the time. So I'm going to call it likely, and that's going to give us an extreme risk. And that probably makes sense. That's probably the thing we should be most worried about. Cool. Walking into a pole, it's probably, I don't know, likely, unlikely, possible, but the consequence is probably minimal. So regardless, you could be anywhere in here. It doesn't matter. It's low risk. Okay, yeah, you might walk into a pole, but you're not going to do any huge amount of damage. We could step on something sharp. So there's a thing. The reason I include this one, we're not going to do all of them. We're only going to talk about a couple. Step on something sharp. I've got it moderate. possible and moderate consequences and possible to happen. And most people will go, but you're wearing shoes. That's not going to happen. Well, we're not wearing shoes yet, all right? So wearing shoes would be a management. It would be personal protective equipment that we would be wearing. You're kind of making an assumption about that. So if we don't make that assumption, if we think we're barefoot, we're pretty high risk. Well, we're at least a medium risk. And we are kind of aware that we can mitigate that pretty easily. But mitigation is the next step. It's coming, all right? Okay, so all of this sort of makes sense. Let's push a limit. Let's talk about getting hit by an asteroid. Well, that could kill you, so it's severe. And it's very, 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 very rare, but I can only go so low as rare, so this still comes in at medium. And this is one of the places where maybe you need to use your brain a little bit and just go, all right, it's vanishingly rare. It's no, we're not really going to do it. But this is a generic risk assessment template. It can't compensate for all of the edge cases, and this is one of the ones where you might be able to break it. Conveniently, the later versions, so the OH&S regulations in this country get updated every now and then. I think there was a big update in 2011 and a smaller update once since then. But they changed some of the wording to say that your responsibility is to create an environment where risks are as low as reasonably possible. And thus, you could argue that protecting from asteroid strikes is unreasonable, and so you're not required to do it. Okay? So, yes, there are examples you can always find which will break this process. It doesn't mean the process is necessarily broken. You just need to be a bit smarter about how you do it. Also, this is an iterative process, okay? So maybe whilst you're doing your risks, you realize something like we didn't define walking particularly well because we don't know how far we were walking, or walking in general didn't really fit, and maybe what we actually wanted was fatigue caused by walking. Maybe that was our hazard. Maybe walking was a step and fatigue was the hazard, and then maybe we could put fatigue into our graph. So the point is just, don't assume you got 100% of your hazards and then you'll do 100% of your risks. Sometimes you got to do some iteration. That's totally fine. The more of these you do, the better you'll get. We also might have realized when we did hazards that we never at any stage considered environmental, physical, reputational, cultural, social hazards, and maybe we should have. Maybe for crossing the road we didn't need to, but remember, we saw those examples of different cultures have very different approaches to how some of this is done, and thus have different hazards, right? So these things can be important as well. Cool. So that's us doing risks. We took our hazards, which are things that were going to hurt us, and then we filtered them to work out what the most important ones were. That was us addressing the risks, okay? Now we're going to go into management. These are the things that could hurt us. This is how likely it is to happen. What are we going to do about it? How are we going to keep ourselves safe? So, what steps are we going to put in to minimize the risk? And we've kind of spoken about one of these already. There was sort of this assumption, but we could specify you need to wear shoes if you're going to go and walk to buy your Powerball tickets. That's an example of a management of personal protective equipment. PPE, you have to wear these shoes. You see this in workplaces all the time. This is a safety boots area. This is a high vis area. You've got to have safety glasses on to enter the lab. Really, really common. And it's actually a really bad way to keep people safe. So it's far better in this case. Sorry, ignore that it says hit by car there. That wasn't meant to appear when it did. It's better if we can clean up the sharp things on the road, right? That's way better than telling everybody, oh, yeah, there's broken glass and cold traps everywhere. Just make sure you wear your boots. No, go clean the stuff up off the road, and then it's a way safer environment, all right? So we actually have... Okay, my animations didn't work exactly the way I wanted them to. I apologize, this shouldn't have appeared yet. I just wanted to talk about this for now. We actually have this thing called a management hierarchy. So what this is the way you're supposed to go through and try and address a hazard, okay? So the absolute lowest tier worst solution is telling people to wear PPE, Okay, that's not what you should be doing. That's only if you failed at every other opportunity do you tell people to do PPE. So the number one thing that we want to do is elimination. Can we eliminate the hazard in the first place? So if we go and we clean up all of the sharp things, then we're fine. The hazard itself is gone. Great. We can't get hurt that way. That's perfect. And then we work our way down. Say we can't clean up all the sharp things on all the roads, on all of the places anyone's ever going to walk. Can we substitute for something else? Can we put in an engineering control, an administrative control, or finally PPE? So not all of these will always make sense in every case. Substitution is generally, can we do a different process instead? So instead of walking across the road, can we ride across the road? And now the hazard's still there, the glass is still there, but sorry, the glass is still there, but the hazard of it hurting us has sort of changed because we've substituted walking for riding or driving or something like that. Can we engineer something? Can we put an administration control in? So an administration control would be putting up a sign that says there is broken glass here, please walk around. Okay, so it doesn't take the hazard away, you just advise people to do something else. You write a procedure for them. And then we go to PPE. So that's the way you want to approach your hazards at all times. Don't just tell them to slap some PPE on. Now, I understand that if you go into a workshop, PPE will be regarded as mandatory. And it is, and to some extent, it's an ass covering exercise by people. And it's just the way that the law works, is whilst it is the bottom tier, because there's generally considered no cost to it, which I don't personally agree with, but yes, PPE will be enforced. But if you're looking at addressing a hazard that you can see as an engineer, you try everything else first before you tell somebody, just slap some PPE on and you'll be fine. Okay? So applying it to a different example, getting hit by a car, you can look before you cross the road. That would be an administration control. Okay, you teach people a procedure to follow. Or we could go to a set of lights or a pedestrian crossing and we could cross there. That's more of an engineering control, all right? So we engineered something, we built a set of lights, or we built a pedestrian crossing, and we put some speed bumps in to slow cars down. So this is us reducing our risk by like building and implementing something. That's an engineering control. It's also partially an administrative control, right? If we put in a set of lights and the lights turn red, it's an administrative control that says a car will stop when that happens. Because there's nothing that physically stops the car. It's just an admin process that stops the car. But better than all of that is don't leave the house in the first place. Buy your lottery tickets online. Elimination. All right. And this is obviously a massive one that we've gotten to explore in the last 12 to 18 months was through the COVID pandemic. You could put a mask on and try and go about your day-to-day work, but that's nowhere near as good as just self-isolate, don't go outside. So we've gotten to see this process be implemented in all sorts of different categories. You've seen elimination, stay home. You've seen substitution, we're going to do classes like this, right? Right now, what we're doing is a substitution process, putting classes online. We've seen engineering controls. We've built, you go into a shopping center or whatever, and they've built screens to protect cashiers and stuff from people. Seen administration controls of only so many people per square meter and all of that type of stuff. And you've seen PPE, masks and stuff all over the place. So you've seen this in practice through a whole bunch of stuff in the last 12 months. Some of it done really well, some of it done less so well. Cool. All right. So the only other thing to address here, I suppose, so we take our hazards, we identify our risks, we go through our management processes to try to reduce those risks, either severity of them or likelihood of them happening. Cool. Great. This is how we do good management. You may not have a brilliant management solution to every single one of the problems, and that's totally okay. All right. You're not always going to have the ability to eliminate or substitute. Sometimes all you're going to have is we're going to put some PP on. That's okay. You just need to acknowledge that you tried, and then you need to make a decision about it. So all of this tends to get summed up into tables. So this is, again, the table that goes with the university risk assessment stuff. And you've got steps of your activities. So we talked about that, right? What are your steps? We're going to walk here. We're going to cross the road. And then of each of those steps, what are your potential hazards? Now, one step can have multiple potential hazards, and that's fine. The way these tables are formatted doesn't always imply that, but it's fine. You might have one thing here, and then you might have like 10 things here. And then you do your risk for each of them, and then you apply your controls or your management strategies. And one hazard might have multiple management strategies, and that's totally fine as well. Then after you employ those management strategies, what's your remaining risk? Are there any hazards that still remain? And is there anything else you need to do? So this is kind of the process that you go through. And then hopefully we can go through that process and we can reduce our hazards down to acceptable levels and everything is hunky-dory. This is going to be a tiny little bit of a tangent, and it's about creating more hazards or new hazards as we try to employ managements, or simply managements that don't actually help solve the hazards. A little bit of a tangent, but this is a very, very important thing for you to understand. So as you put in management processes, does it create new hazards? The really common one that most people will have been exposed to is you have to wear safety glasses in a particular environment, but it's hot and it's sweaty and they keep fogging up and now you can't see. And that creates a new hazard, all right? So in some environments, say you are angle grinding and there's sparks flying all over your face. Well, you actually should be even wearing a face shield, not just safety glasses. But I don't care how much they fog up. It's still worth that, right? Whereas there's other cases where you might be cutting with a knife or something, and there's no real way you're gonna hurt your eyes in this scenario, but if your glasses fog up and you can slice a finger off super easy, maybe your management is actually creating a bigger hazard than it's solving. This is really difficult because it leaves you legally like super open to tell somebody to take off a piece of PPE, so it very, very rarely happens, but you want to be aware of this, okay? Another case of that, well, not over applying PPE, but applying a lot of PPE, particularly for people like welders and things. And it is important for a welder. It's really dangerous. You can get radiation burns and flash burns and all sorts of stuff. But it means they often end up in full long pants, long sleeve shirts, heat-proof gloves, masks in enclosed environments, and often leather aprons over the top of that. You do that on a 40-degree day inside of a 50-degree shed. How long is that person going to last before they're legitimately suffering from heat stroke and exhaustion and things like that, all right? So your management solution there has created a new hazard, and now you need to manage that new hazard. You might need to make sure you can pull that person off the production line often enough to keep them pumped up with fluids, cool them down, those types of things, okay? So that is a thing. Another one is wearing gloves. So gloves are often worn to, stop you getting scratches and cuts and stuff like that. But if you're near a lathe or something like that, they create a hazard where they can get caught in a lathe or a drill or something and rip a finger off. So it's a management that can create a hazard. So you need to be aware of this, all right? An interesting one in the last 12 months and I did a little bit of work on some of these, powered air purifying respirators. You can suffocate in these. So if this hose gets crimped, you can really easily suffocate and die. But they're way better for protecting you from COVID than a normal mask and a face shield is, okay? So this is you going to a higher level of PPE, but creating another risk. And in the situation where you're a doctor treating somebody with COVID, yeah, you take that risk, right? But in other circumstances, it may not be worth it. But yeah. Okay, so that's kind of all sort of related to PPE. Some other issues is the car alarm scenario. So if you've got a procedure that constantly flags absolutely every little thing as a huge big issue, people begin to ignore it. It's a boy who cried wolf scenario, right? And car alarms are now known to be one of these. When people hear a car alarm go off, their response is not to pretty much ever assume that it's somebody breaking into a car and they should call the police. It's just, that's not the response that they get out of people, right? Because they go off so often and so easily. When was the last time you heard a car alarm and immediately called the police? Because if you didn't, it means it's not doing its job. But of course you didn't do that. Nobody does that. So that's a boy who cried wolf scenario. And the other one to just be aware of, and okay, this isn't going to be you for a long time, but eventually you probably will end up in upper management, and you will see this, overly difficult, inconvenient management systems that people just begin to ignore, Okay, so you'll see this. Boy Hook Road wolf scenarios are there's safety signs all over the place, and people just begin to block them out and not pay attention to them. Or things like, oh, you've got to do this, 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 and this before you're allowed to cross the street, and I just go, yeah, I don't care. I'm just going to do it anyway. Okay. So these are things that you need to be aware of from a management perspective. Cool. So all of this sums together to let us know that when we do our risk assessments and things, they in themselves don't necessarily make a process safer. All right. If you have a dangerous process and you do a risk assessment on it, it didn't suddenly become a less dangerous process. It only becomes less dangerous if you can adequately implement those management procedures. So the piece of paper doesn't make a system safer. All right. It doesn't stop you getting hurt. It just allows you to hopefully identify the things that you need to do management for, and allows you to make an informed decision. If you are still going to do a process, you at least understand the risks associated with it. Which means when you do your risk assessments, you should never downplay the risks, all right? You're doing them because you acknowledge that a process is inherently dangerous. And even after you do a risk assessment, and even after you put in all the managements you can, you may still have a reasonable level of residual risk. No matter how safe I try to be, when I walk to go and get my Powerball ticket, I can still get run over by a car. You're not avoiding that. You get in your car, you drive to uni or to work or whatever, you can die in that process. No matter how much you obey speed limits and you stop at red lights and you don't speed and you wear your seatbelt, you can still die in that scenario, all right? So we don't want to downplay our risks. We want to acknowledge what our risks are and make informed decisions on them. We spoke about this before. As low as reasonably possible is generally the terminology that is now used around risk. So that's partially industry relevant, and yes, there is always going to be some risk. We could wrap ourselves in bubble wrap and never leave the house again in our entire lives, but that's not how it realistically works in the real world, right? So there is a level of risk associated with everything that we do. What we want to do is make sure it is as low as reasonably possible. That's our goal. Cool. So there's like 2 or 3 slides to go. Couple of things that I sort of take away, distill all of this down into a few bits of advice for you to take forward as you move on. Number 1, said it before, I'll say it again. Look for the trap, not the cheese. All right? Not, oh yeah, but that shouldn't happen. Don't care. What can go wrong in the process, not what can go right. Take the time, stop, take your engineering hat off of this is how the process is meant to work, put your black hat on, what could go wrong in this process. All right? Make sure you do that, and then you'll find this process is really easy and you're really good at it. Do risk assessments, or assessments of risk regularly, and you can do them quite fast, all right? So there are things that exist called take fives, and these take a couple of minutes. You know, it takes 5 minutes to do a take 5, but realistically it takes about 2 minutes to do a take 5. And you can buy these things as these booklets with like 100 pages in them. And the idea is every time you start a new task, which you might do 2 or 3 times a day or 10 times a day or once a week, it doesn't matter. You just whip this thing out and you're like, have I thought about, am I clear on what the task is? Do I have everything I need to have? Have I made, sure I've got a clean workspace and I know what's going on and da-da-da-da. And you just go bang, 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 bang. Oh, I should actually spend 5 minutes cleaning up my shed before I start hacking away at this thing. Oh, I should really go and put my shoes on because I've still got my thongs on and I'm whippersnipping the backyard. Okay, yeah, I should do that. So you can do this risk analysis that we've spoken about today in a matter of minutes, and it's still really useful sometimes to do it. Okay, so don't think that to do a risk assessment is hours of paperwork. It's super not. You can do a full risk assessment in the paperwork, in the template provided, in under an hour really easily for small projects. And I do them all the time. All right, 15 minutes, let's smash out a quick risk assessment just to make sure we're not doing anything super dumb. You do want to update them periodically. So I do a mini risk assessment at the end of every week for Eng 1500, and I do a take 5 before every class for 1500, just in case something has changed. Hey, people weren't building last week, but they're building this week. Is there anything that we need to do that's different? Yes, we need to clear some space or change this or do something else. Cool. You can just do that as a process. Also, don't be surprised if you get one that's big and important and it takes you several weeks to do. That's also totally fine. Huge bit, really important, do them in teams, all right? So you can do a risk assessment by yourself, that's totally fine, but then bring it to somebody else and get them to go through it. Or do them with somebody else at the same time. It makes an enormous difference to how successful risk assessments are. People just see the world in different ways. And by trying to understand the way the other person sees the world, it makes us see risk so much more clearly. It is so much easier to see risks in a process somebody else is doing than in a process you are doing. So do them in teams. The university's risk assessment template has this up the top of it, and it is what the task is, who wrote the risk assessment, but then who was it reviewed by and who was it approved by. And these are often 3 different people just to make sure that many people look at it and go, yeah, you didn't think about this at all. Oh, yeah, we just assumed that that would be okay. Cool. So do risk assessments in teams. It's heaps better. Be aware, once you get out of this place and you are a professional engineer, particularly if you have tradespeople working under you, if somebody gets hurt and you say, I didn't know, that does not hold up in court. Okay, it just doesn't. So it is your responsibility to know what you are doing, what the people around you are doing, and what any of your employees are doing. All right. So it's my responsibility to keep all of you safe in the Eng 1500 workshops. All right. So if one of you hurts themselves doing a particular process and we get dragged into court and I say, oh, I didn't know that that part of their design would require them to do that. Yep. That does not cut it in the court of law. All right. So be aware, it's your job. If your tactic is to bury your head in the sand when you do risk assessments, it's going to go badly for you one day. And I used to get really annoyed with a lot of the generic templates when I was an undergrad, particularly because we were forced to do some pretty trivial risk assessments, and I was like, this is just a total waste of time. Yeah, I fully get it. The templates will not make sense in every case, and that's okay. Use them to help you when they do make sense. Don't feel bound by them when they don't. All right, final slide, just to provide a little bit of context on why some of this stuff is really important to us as engineers. If you take your category, your age category, I'm just taking a punt here and I'm going to say most of the people in Eng 1500 are somewhere between 15 and 24 or 25 and 44. If not, you can go and find your own category. But this is a table that describes the most likely thing that will that kills people in these categories. Okay, most likely, second most likely, third most likely. So if we come into the categories that we're going to think about here, 15 to 24, 25 to 44, land and transport accidents, accidental poisoning. It's accidents, right? Huge thing that is going to affect you at this point in your life is going to be some form of accident. Whether it's work-related or it's not work-related. Accidents are going to be a big and important thing for you, and so being able to adequately manage your own risk is really important, and the risk of those around you. But also, something else that I want you to take away from this, what's our number one? In both categories, this is our number one, and even here, all right? And it's something we don't think about enough. When we're doing our risk assessments, when we're doing our risk management in life in general, when we're looking after the people around us, suicide is the number one killer of people in your age group. You should be managing the physical health and the mental health of those around you. Safety is everybody's responsibility. That doesn't just apply to cuts and bruises and stuff, okay? Look out for each other. Love each other. Take care of each other. Keep each other safe, okay? Not often enough do we think about all aspects of health, and we need to do it more than we do, particularly in engineering, because these types of things are really predominant in our field. Okay, so it's one thing that I want you all to take out of this is that there are more parts to this than you thought, and it is everybody's responsibility. All right, look after each other, keep being awesome, and you'll be fine. All right, but that's everything I had for you on risk and risk management. I hope it was mildly interesting for you. Coming in an hour right now, so we are done.